The street had a name most people forgot, Old Maple Drive, in the northern edge of Asheville, North Carolina. Surrounded by aging oaks and whispering wind, the neighborhood sat quiet, as if afraid to speak its own story. Children no longer played in the yards. Porches stayed empty, swings rusted still, and mailboxes filled slowly and were emptied without eye contact. But there was one house in particular, number 238, the last on the curve, where time hadn't just slowed, it had. No one mowed the lawn, the shutters drooped like eyes too tired to stay open, and in the thick summer air of July, the heat didn't just press down on the street, it lingered like breath held too long. It had been exactly 33 years since anyone had crossed the threshold of that house willingly, not since the day 3 little boys vanished, triplets, each with the same round face and gap-toothed grin. Not since Margaret Lawson last heard their voices echoing through the kitchen. Not since that ordinary afternoon when the sky was blue, the lemonade was cold, and her boys were laughing on the sidewalk. Daniel, Ethan, and Leo. They had bikes. They had helmets. They had a promise to be home before dinner. They never made it back. On the morning everything started again. The wind changed. Hannah Morales stood in the driveway across the street, sweating through her flannel shirt, despite the early hour. Her husband David was inside pulling up drywall. They had just bought number 241. Cheap, too cheap. A fixer-upper, needs love, the agent. But what Hannah felt as she looked across at the Lawson house wasn't just neglect. It was presence, like something behind the peeling paint and warped shutters was watching. "Coffee?" David called through the open window. She shook herself out of the trance. "Yeah, coming." Inside, the floor creaked like bones shifting beneath the house. The air smelled of mothballs and old carpet, the kind of house that hadn't heard laughter in years. David knelt in the garage with a crowbar in hand, grunting as he pried a warped panel from the wall. "Why is this corner framed in? Makes no sense. There's no support beam here." Hannah appeared behind him, mug in hand. "Maybe they hid something. People used to hide valuables in walls, right?" "Or bodies," David said. But the moment the wood gave way, his face changed. Behind the drywall was a narrow, hollow space. Dust swirled in a sharp beam of sunlight. Something sat wedged between the studs, a wooden crate sealed with rusted nails. It was no bigger than a milk crate. Faded marker scribbled a name on top. Ethan. The air shifted. Hannah crouched beside him, breath caught. "We should stop." But David had already pulled the crate out. It wasn't locked, just stubborn. When the lid finally gave, the smell hit first. Old earth and metal and something sweet that had rotted long ago. Inside were children's things. A toy police car missing 2 wheels, a tangle of rubber bands and plastic army men, a school library card laminated in cheap plastic, a crumpled Pokemon sticker, and a photo. Hannah picked it up gently, the paper thin with time. 3 identical boys stood in front of a house porch, this porch, wearing red jackets. They grinned at the camera like they had no idea they were about to vanish forever. The next hour blurred. Hannah searched. It didn't take long. "Triplets missing Asheville, North Carolina," she typed. There it was. Daniel, Ethan, and Leo Lawson, age 8, last seen July 12, 1990. Disappeared between school and home. No suspects, no trace. The article was short, no quotes, no updates, just a date and 3 black and white faces beneath it. But Hannah's gut twisted when she saw them. She looked at the photo again in her hand. They weren't just missing, they were buried, or worse, forgotten. By 3 p.m., there were 2 patrol cars in the driveway. One officer stayed near the garage. The other knocked politely, took notes, and said things like historical case, evidence logging, and "we'll be in touch." Hannah wanted to scream, but the woman who arrived just before sunset didn't need to be told how. Margaret Lawson, older now but not weak, silver in her hair, deep creases around her eyes, and a stillness that came from surviving something no one was. She stood across the street, staring at the house she hadn't looked at in decades. "I'm sorry," Hannah said. Margaret nodded once. "You found their things." She looked at the photo. Her hand trembled as she did. "I never had this one. I thought I remembered every picture, but not this one." She took a breath so deep it shuddered through her body. "I always thought someone knew. I just didn't know who." That night, rain began to fall over Asheville. Not a storm, just a slow, soft drizzle that pattered against windows like fingers tapping to be let in. Hannah couldn't sleep. The house felt awake, like it had stories to tell. She got up, walked barefoot to the garage. The crate still sat on the bench, empty now, but the dust ring it left behind felt like a shadow. She reached behind the exposed wall, brushing her fingers along the wood. Then she felt it, carved into the beam, not written, scratched, with a nail or something sharp. A single word: help. Across the street, Margaret sat on her front porch in a rocking chair that hadn't moved since 1990. She held the photo, and she whispered their names. Daniel, Ethan, Leo. The street was quiet until it wasn't. A light flickered on in the Lawson house. No one had lived there in 3 decades. Upstairs, near the attic, laughter, children's laughter. Margaret didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes, full of 33 years of grief, were suddenly wide open. They were back. Or someone wanted her to believe they were. Before the silence came, Margaret Lawson's house was filled with noise. It wasn't just the sound of boys, though that alone could rattle the windows and shake picture frames. It was the rhythm of a life lived deeply. Saturday pancakes burning on the edges, laundry never quite folded, 3 sets of muddy shoes lined up by the door and never where she told them to stay. They were triplets, but not in the way people imagined. They didn't finish each other's sentences. They weren't always in sync. They were 3 versions of light, same flame, different flickers. Daniel was the loudest, always first to speak, to jump, to test the rules and rewrite them. Ethan was quieter, but fast, quick with comebacks. He asked why more than any child Margaret had ever known. Leo was the soft one, the dreamer. He talked to animals and wrote notes he hid under his pillow, signed with hearts and the word secret. Margaret loved them all the same way a storm loves the trees, completely, without question, and with the power to break. She was 29 when they were born. A teacher at a local preschool, married to a jazz pianist named Robert, who could never remember what day it was, but always knew the right chord to play when she... Their house on Old Maple Drive wasn't much, but they painted the nursery yellow, not knowing they'd need 3. And when the boys came home, squirming, squawking, and impossibly small, Margaret thought, this is how it begins, the best part of my life. And for 8 years it was. The day they vanished, Margaret was making meatloaf. She remembers that. The oven was preheating. The window was open. The boys had just gotten home from school, dropped their backpacks, and taken off on their bikes. Just around the block, they said. "I'll call you when dinner's ready," she shouted after them. That was the last time she heard their voices. No screams, no screech of tire, just a soundless cut. The hours that followed blurred like water on ink. Margaret called Robert first, then the neighbors, then 911. The search started immediately. The street filled with flashing lights and loud voices. Volunteers combed the woods. Officers questioned anyone within 5 blocks. Flyers were printed before midnight. 3 matching faces, 3 names, no answers, no leads. By the 3rd day, Margaret stopped eating. By the 5th, the casseroles started arriving. By the 7th, people stopped knocking. The town didn't forget the boys. Not really. But it moved on, and Margaret didn't. She couldn't. She stayed in that house long after Robert left. His grief was loud, erratic, volcanic. He couldn't sit in the silence, couldn't sleep in the room that still smelled like crayon and baby shampoo. So he moved to Atlanta, found a new apartment, stopped answering her calls. By year 2, the divorce was final. Margaret didn't argue. Some griefs split people open. Others swallow them whole. Margaret learned to live inside the ache. She stopped teaching, stopped going to church, stopped decorating for Christmas, but she never stopped searching. She had binders, dozens, full of clippings, notes, printed police reports, letters from psychics, false sightings, and every email thread with every detective who had once promised they wouldn't give up. But they all did. The case went cold. 1994 officially. She held on to it alone. By the time she was 60, Margaret was the woman people whispered about. She used to be someone. She's the one who lost the triplets. She never left Asheville. She didn't mind the whispers, let them talk. What no one ever saw was the room. The bedroom, still painted yellow, 3 twin beds perfectly made, a stuffed bear on each pillow, the same nightlight in the corner, and the calendar on the wall. Still frozen on July 1990. She never gave an interview, never published a book, never started a foundation. She just waited. Waited for a knock that never came. Waited for a phone call that wouldn't arrive. Waited for a miracle no one believed in. Until that afternoon, until the phone rang, and a young woman's voice said, "I think I found something that belongs to you." When Margaret stepped onto Old Maple Drive again, it didn't feel like walking. It felt like being carried by something ancient. Memory, maybe? Or desperation. The house hadn't changed. The grass still grew tall. The mailbox still leaned left. The upstairs window still had that crack in the corner shaped like a lightning bolt. She hadn't walked up that driveway in 33 years, and yet her feet knew exactly where to go. She didn't cry when Hannah handed her the photo. She didn't cry when she saw the name scratched into the wood. She cried when she stepped inside the Morales garage and smelled the dust. That same scent of summer 1990, of dry heat and bike tires and peanut butter sandwiches. Because for a second she felt it. Not pain, not memory. Presence. Later that night she sat alone in her kitchen, the photo on the table, the crate beside her. Her hand hovered over the edge of the wood, tracing the outline of Ethan's name. The house was still. The street was silent, but Margaret's mind was loud. Here, what if they had been all along? She opened the drawer beside her and pulled out a key, one she hadn't touched. It unlocked the door to their old. The room was exactly as she left it, but the air felt different, heavy, charged. She stepped inside, turned on the lamp, and one of the beds was rumpled, a crease in the pillow, a faint shape in the blanket, as if someone had been sitting there, or lying down. She didn't sleep. She didn't leave the room. She sat in the chair by the window until sunrise, gripping the photo like a compass, and just before dawn, the light changed. It flickered like a bulb on the edge of death. And Margaret. 3 knocks. Upstairs, in the attic. Not loud, not enough to remind her this story isn't over. Not even close. The attic door hadn't been touched in decades. It was narrow and old, nestled in the hallway ceiling. Margaret stared at it from the top, her fingers gripping the banister hard enough to ache. The 3 knocks had stopped. But the silence they'd left behind was worse. She reached for the pull string. It trembled as she tugged. A puff of dust fell. The wooden ladder groaned open. Air escaped like a held breath. Cold, dry and oddly sweet, like old perfume and mildew. She climbed. The attic was dim. The only light came from a small side window, cracked at the edge, letting in the faintest blue morning haze. Dust moved in slow spirals. Nothing had changed. Old boxes, childhood drawings, a broken rocking horse. But something was wrong. In the far corner beneath a moth-eaten blanket, something shifted. Margaret froze. "Hello?" No answer. She took a step. The wood creaked beneath her heel. Another step. The blanket moved. She pulled it back. Just an old child's coat. Red, size small. She hadn't seen that coat in 33 years. It belonged to Ethan. The lining had a name tag stitched by her own hands, and beneath the coat, folded carefully, was a page from a school notebook, yellowed and warped. Crayon letters, "I didn't go." That was all. Across the street, Hannah Morales stood in her kitchen holding the photo again. Something was bothering her. The background. She zoomed in. Then again. Behind the boys, barely visible, just over Daniel's shoulder, was a shape. Tall, human-shaped, blurred, almost unnoticeable. She enhanced the image as best she could. Someone had been standing behind them, watching. Later that afternoon, Hannah went back into the garage. She brought a flashlight this time. She scanned the studs, the floorboards, the concrete. Near the back corner, behind the shelves, she found another mark, like the one that said, "Help," but this time carved lower. "Don't follow the dog." That night, rain came again. Margaret stood at the window, staring at the Lawson house. Lights flickered in the empty rooms. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the porch light blinked twice. Then a sound from the attic again, but not knocks. Laughter. Short, echoing, familiar. She gripped the windowsill. Tears welled in her eyes. "Ethan?" The sound stopped. Detective Kira Dawson returned the next morning. She was 42, sharp-eyed, calm, and used to unsolved things. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in trauma that echoed. She'd seen it. Her own daughter had disappeared in 2009. Different state, different story. No closure. She stood in the Morales garage, staring at the empty crate, gloves on, eyes wide. "What else was in it?" she asked. Hannah showed her everything, the sticker, the toy, the notebook, the photo. Kira examined the Polaroid like it held a code. "I want to scan this." Then her eyes locked on the wall. "What's this?" she asked, crouching. "The carving." "Don't follow the dog." She froze. "What dog?" Hannah shook her head. "I don't know." Margaret knew. She hadn't said it in years. But the memory lived, buried deep. His name was Maxwell, a retriever. Golden, friendly, owned by an old man who lived 3 houses down. Name long forgotten. Her boys loved that dog. They used to pet it through the gate. She had warned them not to talk to strangers, but the dog made it feel safe. Now she remembered something. Leo used to leave treats in his pockets. She hadn't thought about that in decades. That afternoon, Detective Dawson walked the street, interviewed the neighbors. Most had moved, some had died. A few remembered. One name came up. Harold Fielding. Lived in number 231, alone, widow, died in 2001, no children. "She always smelled like tobacco and Windex," an old neighbor said, kept to himself. "That dog, though, big one, named Max or something." Dawson wrote it down. Later that day, she requested property plans from the county, floor layouts, permit records. One note stood out. In 1991, a private contractor sealed off part of the garage. Reason: storage optimization. That wasn't on any original blueprint. The next morning, Margaret returned to the attic. She couldn't help herself. She sat by the window, holding the coat in her lap. Outside, she saw a man standing at the corner of the Lawson house. Not a neighbor, not anyone she recognized. Just standing there. Then he turned and vanished behind the trees. At 2:15 p.m., Hannah screamed. David came running from the basement. She was in the garage, kneeling by the crate space. "I found something," she said, trembling. Behind the studs, beneath the insulation, was a small metal box. Inside, a pair of boys' glasses, one lens cracked, a birthday card addressed to Ethan from Leo, and a photograph. Same 3 boys, but older, 10, maybe 11. They sat on a wooden bench, backs to the camera. One held a dog leash. The dog was gone, But in the distance, over a small hill, stood the same figure from the previous photo, blurred, watching. Again. Detective Dawson took the box, scanned the photo. The hill behind them was not in Asheville. No known location matched. She checked the timestamp on the image's corner, not visible at first, but with light enhancement, one date appeared, July 18, 1992. 2 years after the boys had disappeared. Margaret sat in her kitchen that evening, holding the photo like it might warm her hands. "They were alive," she whispered. "After they were taken, they were alive." She stood, walked to the bedroom, took out a box from beneath the bed. Inside 3 envelopes, each one with a lock of hair, each labeled. She had kept them all these years, Daniel, Ethan, Leo, and at the bottom of the box, a note, one she had forgotten about, a drawing Leo had made, stick figures, a dog, a house. One figure had X's over the eyes. Beneath it, "He's not nice." That night, the attic door opened on its own. The next morning, Detective Kira Dawson sat in the back of the Asheville Public Records Office, blinking beneath fluorescent lights, sifting through boxes that smelled like dust and stale toner. She wasn't supposed to be doing this alone. But this case didn't follow protocol, and neither did she. The blueprint of 231 Old Maple Drive, Harold Fielding's house, sat unrolled on the desk. She scanned the garage layout. Something was off. There was a wall that shouldn't be there. And a room labeled "Storage Converted." She made a note. Who converted it? When? She looked back at the photo of the boys on the bench. The timestamp, July 18, 1992, 2 years after their disappearance. They had survived, and no one knew. Across town, Margaret and Hannah sat side by side on Margaret's couch. Between them, the box from the wall, the birthday card, and the drawing. Margaret held the drawing like it might crumble. "He's not nice," she read aloud. "Leo drew that," Hannah asked. "He always drew like this. The X's over the eyes. I've seen that before. When his goldfish died. When he was scared." She touched the page gently. This was a warning. Kira left the records office with a file tucked under her arm. She drove straight to the county hospital. Inside, she spoke to a nurse who had been working since the 80s. The woman blinked when Kira said Harold Fielding's name. "Oh, yeah, he was here. Stroke in '01, died before Christmas, didn't talk much. Had a part-time caregiver, young guy, came and went." Kira's pulse quickened. "Name?" the nurse thought. "Ralph Maddox, I think." Kira wrote it down. That name wasn't in the police files from 1990, not once. Back at Margaret's house, the doorbell rang. A woman stood on the porch, mid-60s, with cropped silver hair and a floral blouse buttoned all the way up. "Hello," she said slowly. "My name's Carla Fielding. Harold was my uncle." Margaret blinked. "I remember you. You used to come visit in the summers. I didn't know he lived so close to—" "Happened," Carla said. "Not until I saw the article yesterday." Margaret's voice was quiet. "What article?" Carla pulled a folded newspaper from her bag. Front page, "Breakthrough in Cold Case. Evidence found in Asheville triplet disappearance." Margaret's face paled. Her boys were news again. Carla continued, "After he died, I cleared out his house. I found this in a locked drawer." She handed over an envelope. Inside was a photo. Same boys. Older again. 12, maybe. But now they were only 2. Daniel and Ethan. Leo was gone, and behind them stood a man in a baseball cap. Face turned, mostly hidden, but the dog in front of him was unmistakable. Maxwell. Still alive. Margaret's hands trembled. They were still together, she whispered. Detective Dawson tracked the name Ralph Maddox through hospital and employment records. It led her to a P.O. box, long closed, and an address outside of Hickory, North Carolina. A trailer, rural, private. When she arrived, it was abandoned, but in the shed, Behind stacks of rusted tools, she found a shoebox. Inside, a child's sock, a silver dog tag with M engraved, and a folded journal page. Scrawled in pen, "He buried one. I helped move the others." "I told them not to tell." Kira returned to Asheville that night with the evidence bag. Margaret stared at the sock. It was green, with tiny dinosaurs. "Leo used to wear these," she said. "What do you think it means?" Hannah asked. Margaret looked at the dog tag. "I don't think Maxwell was just a pet." That night, Kira dreamed of her daughter, not as she was when she vanished, but older, changed, a stranger. She woke, gasping. She walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stared at the boxes covering her table. Photos, notes, names. She noticed something new. The handwriting on the journal matched the handwriting in the birthday card, both written by Leo. 2 days later, the police returned to 231 Old Maple Drive. They tore up the floorboards in the sealed storage room. They found a trap door. Underneath, a small dirt-floored crawl space. Inside, a child's shoe, a flattened Pokemon card, and the bones of a dog. Maxwell. Margaret stood at the edge of the dig site, tears streaming. "They killed him," she whispered, "because he protected them." Kira nodded. "Or because he saw something." That evening, Hannah sat at her desk, scanning old-school yearbooks. One of them, a 1992 print from a private religious school in Virginia, had been mailed anonymously to the Morales house. Inside, class photos. On page 37, 2 boys, identical. Different names, different haircuts. But Margaret knew. Daniel, Ethan, they had been enrolled under aliases. Kira made a call to the school. "Yes," the woman said on the phone. "We had twin boys for 1 year. Their guardian was a man named Gerald Moss." "Did they leave a forwarding address?" "Only a P.O. box in Texas." That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. She wandered into the garage, shined the flashlight on the far wall. More scratches. Faint, but clear. "He took us to the desert. We're not the only ones." They left Asheville before dawn. Detective Kira Dawson drove. Margaret sat in the back seat, hands trembling in her lap. Hannah, riding shotgun, clutched a folder marked Moss, P.O. Box, TX 93A. They weren't going off rumors now. They had a lead, a name, a location. The boys had been taken to the desert. The drive took 15 hours. The road cut through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, every state feeling heavier than the last. They stopped for gas in a small town near Lubbock, Texas. The man behind the counter blinked when Kira asked about the address. "You're looking for the Cedar Ridge Farm?" Kira raised an eyebrow. "Is that what it's called?" "Locals just call it the Haven, some kind of program for troubled boys. Religious, I think." Margaret's mouth went dry. "Do they still operate?" "Sure, quiet bunch. Don't advertise. But trucks go in and out every few weeks." He paused. "Y'all looking for someone?" Margaret didn't answer. She didn't need to. Cedar Ridge Farm sat behind a rusted iron gate. The sign read, "Haven for the Lost, Est. 1993. Structure is love." Kira flashed her badge to a woman at the gate. Sister Althea, thin and pale, led them down a gravel path toward the main house. Children watched them from a distance, mostly boys, all between 10 and 16. None of them smiled. Kira whispered, "They look drugged." Hannah shook her head. "They look trained." Inside the main house, a man waited, tall, thin, silver hair, sun-damaged skin. His eyes were pale blue, empty. "Welcome," he said. "I'm Harold Moss." Margaret froze. That was the caregiver, the journal writer, the one who had helped cover everything. He pretended not to recognize. But when she said, "I'm Margaret Lawson," he blinked. "No, don't lie. I only helped move them. Vernon told me it was temporary. Said their parents were drug addicts, that he was saving them." "Do you expect me to believe that?" Kira asked. "No," he said quietly. but I needed to believe it. They found the boys' names in the original registration ledger, Daniel and Ethan Moss, entered August 1991. But no Leo. Margaret's voice cracked. "Where is my son?" Harold looked down. There was a third, but he didn't adapt. He cried, refused to eat. He kept a notebook. Vernon read it and got angry. "What did he do?" Kira demanded. Harold's voice went hollow. He said Leo was broken, that the desert could bury what couldn't be fixed. They excavated the garden behind the chapel. Underneath the lilac bushes, the dogs began to bark, and then a lunchbox, red, rusted, bent. Inside, a dinosaur sock, a note with stick figures, a name tag, Leo no remains. But Margaret fell to her knees because the note was in Leo's handwriting, and it read, "I'm not gone, just hiding." The next shock came from Kira's call to the Texas Department of Health. Vernon Hale, dead since 2001, had filed a foster application in 1989. 3 boys. One was reassigned, his name, Gabriel Knox. Hannah stared. "Gabriel?" Kira's voice dropped. "A replacement." They drove to Amarillo. In a small red house near the highway, they found him. Gabriel Knox, age 34. He opened the door slowly. Black curls, deep-set eyes, a face that mirrored Daniel and Ethan like a ghost. "Can I help you?" he asked. Margaret stepped forward. "I think you already did." Inside, Gabriel told them the truth. He had been brought to the Haven at age 4. He remembered Maxwell, the dog. He remembered 3 boys. He remembered when Leo vanished. "They told me he ran away," Gabriel said, "and then they told me I was Leo." Margaret trembled. "Did you believe it?" "I wanted to," he said, "because I wanted a family." Kira brought out the drawing. "Do you remember this?" Gabriel's face paled. "I drew something like that with him. We used to pass it under the door. He'd write the words, I'd color." Margaret whispered, "He was still alive?" Gabriel looked up. "I think so." That night, Kira stayed up reading through the original journals found in the trailer. The final entry was dated October 1993. He took them, said the farm wasn't enough, said he had help in Arizona. He used names I didn't recognize. One of them wore a badge. She froze, then flipped to the inside cover. There, scratched in the paper, E.C. 4/12/90 Daniel, Ethan, Leo. They traced a vehicle registration from 1993 to a storage barn outside Tucson, Arizona, registered to Gerald Fielding, alias used by Vernon Hale. Inside the barn, a red Cadillac, a duffel bag, and a set of school ID cards partially burned. Daniel, Ethan, Leo. And one more, Gabriel Knox. Margaret stood outside the barn in the Arizona wind, holding the IDs like they were fragments of her children. "They were all there," she said, "together, for years." Kira nodded. But only 2 made it out. They returned to Asheville in silence. No words on the plane, no music in the car, just the weight of everything they now knew and what they still didn't. Leo Lawson had vanished not once, but twice, first from the world, then from the story. Buried behind silence, bureaucracy, fake names, and just enough hope to keep Margaret alive. But now, there were only fragments left, and Margaret held them all. Daniel and Ethan arrived 1 week later. 2 men, grown now, walking into a house that hadn't heard their laughter since they were 8. The reunion was quiet. Margaret didn't run. She didn't fall apart. She just opened the door. And when she saw them, older, taller, changed, her hands didn't reach for their faces. They reached for their eyes, because those hadn't changed. They sat in the living room for hours, no rush, no interrogation, just moments. Ethan touched the old bookshelf and whispered, "He used to hide jelly beans behind the books." Margaret smiled. "Leo did, then blamed you." Daniel nodded slowly. "That sounds right." She brought out the box of drawings. Both boys leaned in. "This is his," Daniel said, pointing to one. "I remember." Gabriel was in the room, quiet in the corner. "He always wanted wings," Ethan said, "to fly away." Margaret turned to him. "Did he ever try?" Daniel's voice cracked. "He tried everything." The next day they went to the cemetery. There was no body, but Margaret had placed a stone anyway. Leo Lawson, 1982. Our quiet flame. She knelt in the grass, the wind lifting her hair. Ethan and Daniel stood behind her. Gabriel watched from a distance. Then, slowly, he approached. He held something in his hand, a plastic bracelet made of faded beads, the same kind Leo had worn, the same kind Gabriel had believed was his. He placed it at the base of the stone and whispered. That evening, the house was full for the first time in decades. Dinner wasn't fancy: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, a cherry pie from a neighbor who remembered. Margaret didn't speak much, but her eyes never stopped watching, every fork clink, every shared glance, every laugh that escaped. This was what had been stolen, and somehow returned. Later, Ethan and Daniel sat on the porch steps, Margaret in the rocker behind them. Gabriel leaned against the railing, arms folded. "There's something I don't get," Ethan said. "If Leo really ran, where did he go?" Margaret looked up and gave them the truth. "He never ran," she said. "He was taken again, buried again, but not by Vernon." They turned to her. She held up a file. "I got it yesterday. DNA results. There were bones in the Arizona desert, buried near a rest stop." Silence. Too degraded for full ID, but the socks, the notes, the dental fragments. Her voice cracked. It was him. Daniel dropped his head. Gabriel closed his eyes. Ethan whispered, "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" "Because I didn't want to bury him twice." But not all was lost. Kira returned the next day. She brought files, papers, and a quiet smile. "You were right," she said to Margaret. "It wasn't just your sons. There were others." She opened the folder. Inside, names, aliases, journals, kids erased, then reassigned. "We found 3 of them," Kira said, "in New Mexico, Texas, Oregon." Margaret whispered, "Still alive?" Kira nodded. Gabriel stepped forward. "What happens now?" "That's up to you," Kira said. "But the truth's out. We're reopening everything." She looked at Margaret. "It started with Leo. It ends with justice." That night Margaret walked into the backyard. She had dug 3 small holes. In each she planted a lily, one for Daniel, now home, one for Ethan, now known, one for Leo, now at peace. Then she added a 4th. For Gabriel, whose name was once borrowed, but whose love was real. The house on Mulberry Street had new curtains again. It was a small detail, almost insignificant. But to Margaret it meant everything. The sun was allowed in again. Light no longer hid behind dark fabrics, and every morning became a chance to remember that even with the absences, life was still present. Daniel and Ethan didn't move back in, but they came every Sunday, bringing simple things: pastries from the corner bakery, old newspapers, childhood photos that finally made sense. They had questions, but also laughter, and that, Margaret understood, was its own kind of healing. Gabriel stayed in Asheville, not in the house he didn't place that wasn't originally his, but in a small apartment 4 blocks away. He opened a children's art studio, called it Leo's Wings. "For kids who draw what they can't say," he explained. Margaret visited sometimes. She always left quietly, eyes misty, heart full. Kira Dawson got offered a promotion, but turned it down. "Not yet," she said. "There's more digging to do." She launched a task force focused on reopening child disappearance cases from the 80s and 90s with similar profiles. They called it Project 33, in honor of how long Margaret had waited. The front yard bloomed that summer, and in the fall, Margaret received a letter. No return address, handwritten. Inside, a single line. He never really left. He just waited for someone to see him. Enclosed was a small plastic child's necklace, blue, faded, a silver L dangling from the center. Margaret fell to her knees on the kitchen floor, because that wasn't mentioned in the desert report. Someone, a boy, now a man, may have survived, or maybe not, but someone remembered, and someone sent the necklace. Months later, a city team began restoring the old Whitley Elementary School. During renovations, they found a box behind the library wall. Inside, a VHS tape labeled Leo L., a notebook filled with airplane sketches, a single note in shaky handwriting, "For my mom. I didn't know if you'd come back, but I stayed anyway." Margaret played the tape on an old TV. The footage was grainy. It showed 3 boys dancing in an empty classroom, Leo on the left, Daniel in the middle, Ethan struggling to keep up. They laughed. They ran. At the very end, Leo turned directly to the camera and whispered, "You'll find me." On the last Sunday of spring, Margaret walked alone to the lake where they used to ride bikes. She sat on the wooden bench where Leo loved to skip stones. Beside her, a pair of small sneakers, dirty, worn, weathered, rested like an offering. She didn't turn around. She didn't search. She just smiled, because she understood. He was never really lost, just waiting to be remembered by someone who never stopped looking.